At this time of year, on every Sunday in the United States, millions upon millions of Americans have a weekly ritual. They'll make the pilgrimage to their local stadium or sports bar or living room and watch the game.
40 seconds to go. Pearce firing for the end zone.
The National Football League, or NFL, is one of the most lucrative, widely watched sporting brands on the planet.
And they go to the end zone and touchdown!
It is bombastic, very, very popular and exhilarating, both for those watching what happens on the field.
It's a short punt. Gibson on the return, near side.
And those paying more attention to what happens in the stands.
Oh, and yet, she's here. Taylor is in the house.
But for the past decade, the NFL, along with every other contact sport around the globe, has been engulfed in a crisis that only seems to be getting worse.
Huge decision has just been made in that NFL concussion lawsuit.
More stories of NFL veterans diagnosed with permanent brain disease has...
Top researchers revealing former NFL player Phillip Adams had an unusually severe case of CTE when he went on a deadly rampage in April.
Now, one 26-year-old athlete is wrestling with a life-changing decision, being watched not only by the NFL, but by sporting leagues across the planet. I'm Emma Hoy, and this is Leave It to the Experts. Let's start in January 2018, deep into a rare second overtime in the final game of the NCAA's college football season. The University of Alabama's 20-year-old freshman quarterback steps up in front of 77,000 fans.
Tagovailoa trying to make up for it. Fires to the end zone. Touchdown! Alabama wins!
Tua Tagovailoa etches his name into sporting folklore, dominating the next season. His team came just one win short of back-to-back national championships.
Tagovailoa looking to his left. Looped deep in the end zone. Jump ball. Touchdown!
Then, Tua's career came to a screeching halt.
He's down. And Tua's down. His helmet came off.
In one single play, he dislocates his hip, fractures his nose, and suffers a concussion. A year later, he turns professional.
So with the 5th pick, the Dolphins select Tua Tagovailoa, quarterback, Alabama.
NFL quarterbacks are the princes of US sport, carrying the weight of their team and their city on their shoulders. These mega sporting brands, known the world over, build entire franchises around this single position. And at Miami, Tua's first 2 seasons in the NFL were bumpy. But in 2022, it all began to turn around.
Tagovailoa. Blocked by Armstead. Tua to the end zone. Caught for the touchdown!
At just 24, Tagovailoa's star was rising fast. But then the millions who had followed his career since college saw an uncomfortable, all too familiar sight.
Tagovailoa suffered some type of an injury on this play.
Tua is hit hard. He stumbles backwards, his head bounces off the turf. After scrambling to his feet, he can only muster a few steps before his knee buckles and he collapses. It takes 2 of his teammates to restrain him from going back on to play. And about 30 minutes later, he's back on the field, playing out the game in obvious discomfort. He is in pain and his movement is clearly limited, but still, he guides his team to a narrow 2-point win. Forced to undergo assessment by a neurologist to ensure he was not concussed, he's cleared to play with what the team calls a back injury. His coach, Mike McDaniel, defended the decision.
Trying to talk to him through the lens of, hey, is there something wrong with your head? And no, I'm fine. And it was something that we wouldn't have moved forward in the direction we did had there been any sort of red flags.
But then, Tagovailoa was leveled again.
To a rolling left with the grain, and down he goes.
This time by opponent Josh Tupua, a man mountain at 191 centimetres tall, weighing in at 160 kilograms. As he buckles under the tackle, Tua's arms go into the fencing position, a reflex in which the arms extend and the fingers curl, which only happens after a significant brain injury. Many begin to question whether Tagovailoa could ever play again. Dr. Bennett Omalu, the neuropathologist portrayed by Will Smith in the football film Concussion, urges him to walk away.
I'll tell him, Tua, my brother, I love you. Stop playing.
But just 24 days later, with his team losing all 3 games since his injury, Tagovailoa returns to the field to save a season, slipping away.
Where are you on the Dolphins' offense?
Thinking they could rip through the playoffs and very easily get to the Super Bowl if they stay healthy.
Soon after his return, Tua comes up against the legendary Aaron Rodgers and his Green Bay Packers. Late in the game, with his Dolphins tied, something strange happens.
Tagovailoa. Oh, that one's picked!
The opposition intercepted a Tagovailoa pass. See, that had only happened 4 times from 375 passes all season. But then, he does it again on his next 2 passes.
The 30. 2nd and 13. That's picked off by Devondre Campbell.
The day after the game, it becomes clear what has happened.
That Dolphins head coach Mike McDaniel told reporters that QB Tua Tagovailoa did in fact suffer a concussion Sunday, and
the Dolphins' season was over. After a concussion-free 2023, Tua took the Dolphins to the playoffs, was selected for the NFL's All-Star Game, and began the 2024 season with a fresh contract.
All right, Laura, the deal that the Miami Dolphins and Tua Tagovailoa have been trying to work out has been agreed to. A 4-year, $212.4 million extension.
So why are we talking about this right now? Why is Tua Tagovailoa, now 26 and a father of 2, one of the biggest stories in the NFL? And why does every sports league need to watch this situation?
And concern is growing over Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa after he suffered another concussion on the field.
In the third quarter of the Miami Dolphins game against the Buffalo Bills on September 12th, 2024, the star quarterback collided with Damar Hamlin. Once again, his arm extended and his fingers curled in the fencing position. And his career now sits at a crossroads.
Miami Dolphins star quarterback Tua Tagovailoa is on the injured reserve after suffering the 3rd confirmed concussion of his career.
Tua is out indefinitely while being evaluated for head trauma following his 4th official concussion playing football since 2019. Manti Te'o, former player and a close friend of the Dolphins quarterback, choked back tears discussing the situation on TV.
That when I saw him have to be carted off the field, yeah, I wanted him to walk. That was hard, bro.
But the man in the middle of the situation seems hell-bent on returning.
My understanding is that Tua Tagovailoa has no plans to retire.
Tua hasn't spoken publicly since his most recent concussion, but last year gave the world a glimpse into his mindset.
Yeah, I think I considered it for a time, having sat down with my family.
The team doctor or NFL neurologist refuses to medically clear Tagovailoa. His career will be over, and he'll be paid out the remainder of the $212 million contract he signed in July. But if he is medically cleared, the Dolphins star must either put the helmet back on and return, or forego over $100 million in earnings. It is world-changing money, generational wealth for decades to come. But as NFL legend Shannon Sharpe cautioned, it is not the be-all and end-all.
What good is $200 million if you can't recognize your family? Mm-hmm. What good is $200 million if you don't know who and where you are? What good is $200 million if you can't play with your kids? What good is that?
The financial implications of his situation extend far beyond the quarterback. Top-flight sport is a big business. The higher you get, the more the line blurs between the athlete and the asset. The Miami Dolphins are valued at $6.2 billion. The correlation is clear. The teams that win are the most valuable, and the teams that win are those with good quarterbacks. Tua Tagovailoa is a dynamic player, and perhaps the best Dolphins quarterback since the legendary Dan Marino.
We are seeing another spectacular effort by Marino, who fires. Touchdown!
At 26, he remains one of the 10 youngest starting quarterbacks in the NFL. But if Tagovailoa's career is over, the Dolphins would likely plummet back into football irrelevance. Quarterback is the hardest position to replace. coaches and general managers will have their livelihoods effectively tied to their man. Win and the glory is yours, lose and you're out of a job. There's no doubt that Dolphins coach Mike McDaniel cares deeply about his players.
My thought was concern, and I was just worried about my guys. So, yeah, not something that you ever want to be a part of. You know, you hope not to.
But the rigours of professional sports puts an unconscionable tension on coaches and management. They're asked to be the guardians of young people placed in incredibly vulnerable positions, newfound wealth, fame and scrutiny on a scale most ordinary people will never know. On the other hand, they're employees of companies that trade in trophies. Seasons can be made or ended in the margins with one errant kick, one rolled ankle, one lucky shot. Clubs operate ruthlessly in pursuit of being the sole survivor at the end of a brutal season. Coaches, like Mike McDaniel, are every bit as competitive as their players.
We ain't celebrating yet. You want to talk about some grown-ass men going to war?
McDaniel has never tasted Super Bowl glory, the peak of the sport. And the owner of the Dolphins since 2008, Stephen Ross, has never seen the team progress out of the first round of the playoffs. It is impossible for people in those situations to be completely unbiased about the decisions made respecting their careers. Even if figures like McDaniel and Ross push Tagovailoa to walk away and preserve his future health, they'll be doing so despite the significant factors compelling them to encourage the opposite. All it takes is a coach or an owner blinded by their instinct to win to push a vulnerable young athlete into a life-altering decision.
This is about a guy whose body isn't built for football. That's all this is.
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a progressive degenerative brain disease, more commonly known as CTE. The symptoms are varied and unpleasant. Memory loss, confusion, impaired judgment, impulse control problems, aggression, depression, suicidal notions, and progressive dementia, among others. CTE develops in the brain after repeated impacts to the head, and it can only be diagnosed after death. It has been diagnosed in many athletes involved in horrific crimes.
A researcher says the brain of former NFL player and murder convict Aaron Hernandez shows damage in the area that controls behavior.
Murder-suicide has rocked a Kansas City family and the Kansas City Chiefs family, an entire city. A player, Javon Belcher, shot his girlfriend, drove to the Chiefs practice facility, and took his own life there. We have
And these are just the most extreme cases. For many, the symptoms of CTE will hang over their lives, unbeknownst and undiagnosable until they pass away. It is likely one factor in why some retired athletes struggle with problem gambling, family violence, and mental health. Concussion is threatening to rob Tua Tagovailoa of his career, right when he's a fingertip away from its very apex. Simply making the NFL is an achievement, but deciding to walk away when you've already taken so much punishment and put in so much work, or accepting retirement when you feel like you're the one who could bring a city of devoted fans their first championship in 51 years, would certainly be a difficult pill to swallow. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Jaspin, and I'm the founding editor and director of 360 Info. At 360 Info, we're providing evidence-driven, solution-based journalism, all written by leading experts. Every week, we release new and innovative news content that bridges the gap between the world's brightest minds and the global public. To be part of the fight against misinformation, sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media, or head to 360info.org. If you're a journalist or a publisher or editor, you can sign up for our Newswire service, which is free of charge at newshub.360info.org.
Concussion isn't just threatening high-profile athletes at the very pinnacle of their sport. There are tales from all over the world of athletes who are struggling with head injuries. So, what does the future hold for contact sports when the risks continue to mount up?
Let's bring in our experts, neuroscientist Professor J Pearce from Swinburne University and Dr. Stephen Townsend, lecturer in sports sociocultural studies at the University of Queensland. So, Professor Pearce, let's start with you. A case study that might help our audience understand the real medical ramifications of concussion and brain injuries like this. Tua Tagovailoa, a 26-year-old NFL quarterback, has officially sustained 4 concussions since his college career began. When he suffered his latest concussion, we saw his body respond in a really extreme way where his arms extended and his fingers curled up. So could you explain what's happening to the brain and the body in that moment and why it's reacting like that?
Yeah, so talking about Tua, this is probably not the first time he's actually shown that response, and the technical term is tonic posturing, but otherwise known as the fencing pose. And what we know from this is it's a form of a sort of a benign seizure. So it's where you have the outer part of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex, and it's sort of sitting over the top of the spinal cord, which is called the brainstem. And what we know is that with these sort of situations, there is sort of overexcitement or a seizure in the brainstem that causes this particular reflex. So it looks quite confronting, but it's actually not a overly serious sign of anything long term. It's just that it's essentially a sign of concussion, and we need to make sure that they're properly rested, of course, but it's not a epileptic seizure as such.
Right. This wasn't Tua's first concussion. He's officially sustained 4 since his college career began. So from a medical perspective, how concerned are you about his long-term health?
Well, we know that, multiple concussions can impact on cognitive impairments later in life, and there's been some recent sort of epidemiological studies to sort of show that. But at the same time, there's been some the science has not been yet settled, put it that way. And we've just had a recent study showing that if you play sports and you've had one concussion, you actually seem to improve on some of these cognitive outcomes, which is confusing to all of us. So, we really need to be, looking at this data a little bit more. However, in those that have been sustaining multiple concussions, it certainly has impacted on their cognitive performance and their cognitive health, like memory and concentration and focusing and other behavioural aspects as well, for irritability and brain fog and cognitive fatigue. So, we do need to take every concussion seriously, and every concussion is essentially a brain injury, and we can't downplay that at all.
Right. So given that, as you said, the sort of the research is still coming in on this issue, but I think it seems pretty conclusive now that repeated concussions sustained over many years are going to have negative ramifications. So should we even be playing contact sports?
Yeah, I think we stood still. Yeah. Let's just tease this out a little bit though. So there is there's this conflation of concussion injury with this risk of what we're talking about with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Now, the issue around CTE is that it's not related to concussion injury, and this is one of the big things that's getting confused in the wider community, that when we have an individual or a player, revealing their issues that are probably, dementia or CTE related, everyone starts to go back to concussion and talking about concussion. And, they're actually, the recent research is showing that there is no correlation between concussion and CTE risk. But in saying that, people are getting concussed in non-sporting environments too. Kids get concussed in the playground, and we certainly don't want to see kids not playing, in the playground at school or after school or on weekends. We don't want to become wrapping kids up in cotton wool. What we're saying is that we need two things. One is manage concussions properly, rather than just traditionally sending them back out saying, "Oh, you're fine, don't worry about it." Or players just sort of saying, "Oh, I don't want to be seen as weak, and I'll just continue to, hide my symptoms." But secondly, we can make sports safer, and we can certainly graduate the amount of contact that is played in sport so that we have a a reasonable amount of contact, so that if there is an incidental concussion, we can manage that. But we're not allowing kids in particular to have, a hazardous amount of repeated impacts in the hundreds before their mid-teens, for example. So that's the sort of conversation that we want to have.
Right. So we don't want to stop sport altogether, but we do need to be doing our best to make it as safe as possible for players. I think that turning to Dr. Townsend, that there's certainly concepts of masculinity and toughness wrapped up in a lot of these professional contact sports. So how many of these cultural issues and concussion issues are tied to these sort of cultural notions of masculinity and playing through even when you should perhaps be taking a rest for your brain health?
It's a really good point. And a lot of the issues that we see with concussion are issues with sport and risk cultures more broadly. Concussion's a really interesting issue because it helps us to get a grip with a lot of the sociocultural issues that we see in sport, sporting injuries of all types. Concussion's particularly potent because its consequences can be significant. And Professor Pearce has hit on a really important point here, is distinguishing between concussion and repeated brain trauma, in that the threshold for someone to get long-term neurodegenerative diseases varies from person to person. It varies from groups to groups. But what we're talking about is not necessarily that if you get one concussion, that you are guaranteed to get something like chronic traumatic encephalopathy. But what we do see in the scientific literature is that there is a certain threshold that some people will reach of repeated brain trauma, and that may be something that's classified as a concussion, and it may not be, that will lead then to longer-term neurodegenerative diseases like CTE. And what that indicates is that this is a systemic issue rather than an individual issue, because these injuries and these repeated injuries occur within systems that have for a really long time not valued player welfare, and they've prioritized performance above player welfare and above players' brain health. So there's individual choices that people make, and some of those are related to masculinity, some of those are related to class, some of those are related to race and ethnicity as well. So someone like Tua, who is from a Pacifica background, this is a traditionally disenfranchised group in Australia, but then also in the US as well. And lots of people of colour have seen contact sport as their way of gaining more social mobility. So someone playing the NFL is able to then get more money, more social financial capital for their family by being successful at a dangerous sport. And we see that with people of colour in the US. We see it with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia as well. So there's issues of race, ethnicity, and masculinity and class that all tend to intersect. And these are issues not just for concussion, but for sports injuries and a whole range of other risk factors in sport more broadly. So concussion allows us a really potent window into seeing some of those issues.
Do you think some of those financial and cultural incentives that you've just outlined, tied to these star players like Tua, like filling stadiums and selling merchandise, create an environment where they might feel pressured to return to the game too soon after a head injury?
Yeah, there are absolutely pressures. And again, these pressures are put upon individuals, so individual players, but then also institutions as well. So the teams and the club doctors, this is why Professor Pearce and I have advocated for a long time for the introduction of independent doctors. So like what we see in the National Rugby League in Australia, with having a doctor in the bunker, and we know that's been controversial. We know that lots of NRL fans don't like this. They hate seeing a player get dragged off a field by a disembodied voice in a bunker outside the stadium. It's understandable as to why that would be controversial. But it does protect players. It protects players from themselves, and it protects club doctors from having to make decisions, having pressure placed upon them by coaches, by coaching staff, and by the general context of that game. If it's a finals game, a semi-final, preliminary final, and you've got a star player who gets a concussion, there is an inevitable amount of pressure that is placed upon those decision makers, sports medicine decision makers, to keep those players going because they're athletes. The only way that you can compete as an athlete is to be on the field. These players, they want to play. The club doctors, they want them to play. The clubs want them to continue playing. So there's individual choices that have to be made, but there's also systemic choices that have to be made. So we've advocated for a long time for these independent doctors to relieve some of those pressures.
I think also just to add onto that is the fact that if someone, an athlete does a hamstring, you can clearly see that they're hobbling, or they've done their knee, or they're dislocated. It's a broken bone. It's very obvious, and people can kind of go, okay, yeah, appreciate that. But concussion in particular is a silent injury, so we don't necessarily see what's happening inside the skull, and people think, oh, what's wrong with them? They're fine. There's staggering a bit, but that's that's fine. They're a bit tired, so it sort of adds an extra dimension with concussion and brain injury as opposed to, say, musculoskeletal injuries.
Yeah, of course. And as we've seen over recent years, there's been some really notable class actions that have taken place with former NFL players over in America, and also some former AFL players here in Australia, bringing class actions against their professional leagues, claiming that they were not made fully aware of the risks. Do you think that these leagues have a responsibility to some of these players that have come in previous times where they might not have been armed with the knowledge that they were risking their brains and their bodily well-being?
It's a really difficult question to answer, actually. And there's limited information I can give you around some of this because I'm involved in some legal proceedings, so I have to be a little careful about what I can and can't say. There is certainly a perception that from both sporting leagues and health bodies in the 21st century, so from around 2004, 2005 onwards, and that corresponds with Bennett Amalu's diagnosis of CTE in Mike Webster, who's a former National Football League player in the US, that this was a turning point in concussion studies or concern around concussion, so the beginning of the concussion crisis. There's a sense that this is new, it was unexpected, and how could we have possibly seen this coming because we didn't know beforehand? And what some of my research and some of my fellow historians are beginning to reveal is that this has been an issue for a really long time. Concussion, humans have always got concussions, they've always got brain trauma. Our brains have not changed markedly, well, they haven't changed at all since we've been Homo sapiens sapiens. We are prone to damaging our brains. They're the most important and correspondingly the most fragile organ in our body. And when they're shaken, they sustain damage. That's always happened. So the brain hasn't changed, but we've only really been playing the types of sport that we recognize as sport currently for around 150 to 200 years. These Western European style football high contact games that are really popular in Australia and in the US. So the idea that concussion in contact sport has only become a problem and that we've only known about concussion as being a potentially injurious happening over the last 20 years is laughable. However, what we also do need to be careful about is how much scientific information and how much rigorous scientific research sports medicine folk, sporting leagues, athletes, parents, and administrators actually had access to it at certain points. So in terms of their duty of care for looking after athletes, it's really on a case-by-case basis. So we need to look individually at sporting leagues, at individual cases as well, and not make blanket statements. So certainly there are situations in Australia, in the US, in the UK, and we've seen in these class actions, which have been actually, where the decision has gone against the sporting leagues, where courts and experts have found that, yes, these sporting leagues should have done more to protect their players because they did have access to scientific information. They were told that this was dangerous and they should have done more. But there are also certainly cases in all those jurisdictions where it would not be reasonable for some of these sports medicine folk and the coaches and the league's administrators to have known what was going to happen long term to these athletes' brains. So it's on a case-by-case basis.
So both of you have raised some changes that you would like to see to make these contact sports safer. So we've got the idea that we should have an independent doctor on field at all times. What other changes would you like to see to make contact sports safer for players going forward?
Well, I guess for me, there's two things here. If we look at the concussion issue, I'm still quite perplexed around the difference or the disparity in how long a player should be rested. We see differences between sports. We see, in some sports, they don't even have they're not even taking the recommendations from the Australian Sports Commission on 21 days. So, talking to a few sports at the moment to try and get them to implement that as a mandated policy rather than as a recommendation. We see differences in the number of days between sports. So despite the apparent, using the same evidence and the science, we have one sport with 11 days and another sport with 12 days. So, and with the sport with 11 days, they have categories 1, 2, and possibly 3. So, it's the disparity is quite confusing. So on that side, I think, we need to address a bit more of a systematic approach. On the chronic traumatic encephalopathy side, a lot of us around the world have been advocating for no or limited contact for children up to the age of 14 years of age. What we're seeing with the evidence for the pathology of CTE is that it's an exposure risk. A lot of the cases that we are presenting at the Australian Sports Brain Bank and over at Boston, for example, players started at 5 or 6 years of age with full contact, playing the full adult version of the sport. So if we can at least take it to 14 years of age, that potentially reduces about 8 years of exposure risk. So we're trying to reduce that as well as, reducing the amount of physical contact at training. So we can, monitor that. We can, rather than just training in the old traditional way of smashing each other, reducing that, just trying to take out a number of the risks.
Yeah, I'd agree with Alan. And from a sociocultural, historical perspective, all sports are pretty conservative institutions. They take a long time to change, and particularly a long time to enact cultural change. We've seen this across issues with LGBTQI folk. We've seen it in issues around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folk in the Australian context. And concussion's another example of a problem in sport that's taking a long time to enact cultural change. So we've got lots of information, I would say, from professional leagues down to recreational leagues that parents, players have access to, and they are aware that concussion and repetitive head trauma can cause long-term and short-term damage to the brain. I don't think there's too much doubt out there that is the case. There's different levels of understanding, certainly, but there is certainly an understanding in Australia that brain trauma is bad for the brain, and particularly repetitive brain trauma. I think what we need to do now is start filtering through some of the sociocultural understandings about why we continue to hit our heads against each other. What does this actually say about individuals, and what does this say about us as a society, that we valorize hard contact, that we valorize violence, we valorize this idea of playing through pain, of downplaying symptoms, and start to challenge some of those notions. So as Professor Pearce has said, we don't necessarily want contact sport to stop. I play contact sport, have played contact sport since I was a kid. I have received both benefits and negative consequences from playing contact sport. So it's a complex issue, but we need to provide parents, children, medical professionals, and sports administrators with a more holistic view of the reasons as to why we actually go out and get concussions. And it brings us into this kind of axiological problem where there's a cost-benefit analysis. And there's a cost-benefit analysis from a physiological perspective. Sport, physical activity does great things for our bodies and for our minds in some respects, but it does bad things. Sport also does great things for us socially, culturally, psychologically, but it also has some negative effects for us as well. So we've thought a lot about that axiological balance of physical and cognitive issues, but we haven't really brought in the kind of cultural and social aspects of this. And I think for me, that's the next step in this debate.
Professor Pearce and Dr. Townsend, thank you so much for joining us on Leave It to the Experts today.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Thanks for having us.
For decades, the consensus has been that we let athletes make decisions about their bodies and stay out of the way. But when considering all of the pressure on them to win, to compete, to set their family and friends up financially for generations, to repay the fans, to give franchises a return on investment, and to make good on their childhood dreams, it becomes clear that we're putting athletes in near impossible situations. If Tua Tagovailoa gets his way, he will return to playing quarterback in the NFL, where he'll be again thrown to the ground, collide with other players, and push his body to its limits. The consequences of these decisions may not be known for decades, potentially till after his death. But the ramifications of Tua walking away now, or having the choice taken away from him altogether, will send reverberations through world sport. All sports are scrambling to improve player safety, but this might be their best chance to take a meaningful step in the right direction. It may not be popular with everyone, but it may be the start of a change desperately needed to safeguard the future of these sports. That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. For more, head to 360info.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists and understand our work to fight against misinformation with university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner, Reese Hooker and Lachlan Caselli. Music by Jan Skubaszewski at Red Moon Studios. I'm your host, Emma Hoy, and I'll see you next time.